Chapter 781. This is it. Gong Qi caught the change in Snake Tongue's body in the first instant. His figure closed in, but he didn't interfere. Instead, he carefully observed the aftermath. But on the other side, Snake Tongue had a rather subtle feeling. This was because it wasn't quite the same as before. Her soul had split and a wisp of her soul had returned to Ban City. Instead, the Mirage Chi fog wall was growing thicker and thicker. Moreover, it wasn't only on the plane of her consciousness. It directly affected the material plane and appeared in the cloud world. Could it be as Gong Qi had said? That the powerhouse far away in Earth's spacetime had made meticulous preparations these past few days and changed a method to work on her body? But why was there no pulling force between her soul and flesh for so long? Snake Tongue wanted to contact that person and seize the opportunity to issue a warning. She also wanted to beg that person to help her break away from the clouds and escape Gong Qi's control. No matter what kind of fate awaited her later, as long as she changed her way of living, or even how she died, she could accept it. However, that powerhouse on Earth didn't give her this opportunity. The Mirage Chi fog wall grew thicker and thicker. She hoped for Ban City and the fusion of her soul and flesh, but she still couldn't see a shadow. She didn't know what had gone wrong. Right now, Gong Qi drifted over and spoke to her. Just as he opened his mouth, his voice and transmitted thoughts suddenly became indistinct. It was as if there really was a thick curtain wall separating them, making them indistinct and indistinct. This was a situation neither Snake Tongue nor Gong Qi had expected. Before they could react, the Mirage Chi fog wall rumbled and surged. It erupted and flowed, cutting off their line of sight. As for Snake Tongue, she felt a heavy attractive force appear out of nowhere and act upon her spiritual body. In the blink of an eye, Snake Tongue and Gong Qi had unexpectedly become isolated from each other. Moreover, this attractive force. Snake Tongue. The brief thought was like an ice-cold thorn. It forcefully broke through the Mirage Chi fog wall and pierced inside. Snake Tongue's mind was muddled. Gong Qi instantly exploded with a chill that could nearly freeze her. He suspects me. That this was premeditated? It would be great if there was. Because of Gong Qi's reaction, Snake Tongue suddenly had a flash of inspiration. She no longer cared about the other side. She didn't think too much and she didn't care about her wording. She frantically radiated her thoughts and spirit waves, revealing everything that was going on in her heart. Save me. Save me. No matter what you want to do, no matter what you arrange, I don't want to die, I don't want to become a puppet, save me. The Mirage fog wall completely isolated Gong Qi's figure and weakened his will, allowing Snake Tongue's courage to recover. There was only a thin line separating them, but Gong Qi's entire figure broke through the fog wall and pressed over. He also saw the spreading and shrinking colors, as well as the inconceivable hole in the clouds in the void. The hole wasn't large to begin with. It was just large enough to swallow Snake Tongue's extremely condensed spirit body. Judging purely by his eyes, he could at most extend an arm through it. Furthermore, it was rapidly shrinking. It looked like it was about to disappear into the drifting mist. Gong Qi didn't have time to think too much. His figure distorted into light and accelerated once more. He practically stuck close to Snake Tongue's spirit body and crashed into the hole together. The sky suddenly darkened. In the instant of this change, Gong Qi was already 100% certain that he could capture Snake Tongue. However, his mind inexplicably trembled. He didn't care about anything else. His spirit body that had transformed into light deviated and flew backwards. However, the whistling sand and dust filled the air. When he crashed into it, the hole he had just entered through had already disappeared without a trace. When he crashed into it again, there was only emptiness. Gong Qi was startled. Snake Tongue was only several meters away. It was like she was having an illogical nightmare. By the time she was slightly clear-headed, the shackles of the veil of silence were still there. Gong Qi was also there and he was very close at hand. All the torment hadn't caused any fundamental changes. It was just that the bloody light and mist interweaved in the clouds had turned into a gloomy place where dust and mist surged. Where is this? She had been trapped in the cloud world for half a year. Chaotic clouds and bloody light were everywhere as far as the eye could see. Snake Tongue really wasn't used to suddenly entering a realm with a different hue. All she knew was that this wasn't the Ban City that she yearned for day and night. The dust and mist that fluttered in the sky shouldn't be the same as the fog wall that isolated her from the outside world. The powerful suction force had disappeared without a trace at some unknown time. Snake Tongue felt terrible. It wasn't just her emotions but also her most intuitive feelings. Her spirit body was extremely weak. She had relied on a highly condensed method to prolong her life. But in this gloomy place she felt that something was wrong. Her spirit body was erratic and unstable. Her core structure also showed signs of dispersing. She couldn't piece it back together no matter what. It seemed like in the next second she would assimilate with the dust and mist that filled the sky. She would be torn apart and disintegrated. Chapter 782. A Trap. Gong Qi immediately responded to Snake Tongue. His piercing thoughts carried a bit of ridicule, but the direction he pointed at was rather subtle. I originally thought it was an inside and outside collusion, but now it seems I was overthinking it. That lord of yours made you believe you could return to Ban City and merge your soul and body. In the end he gave you a glimmer of hope and deceived you. Because of this he also deceived me. Especially when you were comparing the two, your mentality was unbalanced. You made a hasty judgment amidst an unforeseen event, and your brain became hot-headed. What a good plan. In this terrible situation, Gong Qi displayed his shrewdness and ruthlessness. He maintained his mentality quite well. At least in front of Snake Tongue he maintained a calm attitude. He slowly moved over and looked at Snake Tongue, who was wrapped in the yarn of silence. She was shaped like a pearl of light, but she was even more fragile than a bubble. I never expected that there would be such a world beneath the boundless clouds. I deserved to be schemed against. But what about you, Snake Tongue? It's already hard to control your scattered spirit body. Instead you have to rely on the yarn of silence to withstand it. It seems that lord of yours doesn't take you seriously. In the end you're nothing more than bait. After the big fish takes the bait you're useless. Gong Qi's thoughts were like a blade. His words struck at the heart and Snake Tongue's pearl of light fluctuated. As it swelled and shrank it looked like it was about to shatter. In reality her spirit body was heavily injured, and her spiritual will had suffered a blow. In addition to the vile environment she was on the verge of death. Seeing this situation Gong Qi furrowed his brows. He no longer provoked her. His previous words had been wasted. Gong Qi's original intention was to destroy Snake Tongue's mental defenses in one fell swoop in this desperate situation. He wanted her to remove the obstacle in her despair and fuse with the yarn of silence, removing the last hidden danger. This would make it convenient for him to focus all his attention on dealing with the great enemy. Unexpectedly, Snake Tongue was even more useless than he had imagined. In fact, it wasn't difficult to transform Snake Tongue into the yarn of silence at this moment. However, she was so weak that she was on the verge of collapse. She might not be able to withstand the impact of the transformation. Once the core structure of her spirit body was destroyed, what benefit would there be in swallowing her? If he wanted to satisfy both sides he would inevitably have to focus his mind and do some meticulous work. This was simply an opportunity for the powerful enemy hidden behind the sandstorm. All sorts of thoughts revolved in Gong Qi's mind. In the end he flicked his finger and sent a speck of light into the veil of silence. It changed slightly and poured some life force into Snake Tongue. It's better to keep it for now. After all, the connection between the soul and flesh is a clue. In this maze realm where the laws are in chaos and time and space are collapsing, I have to hold on to any thread. I can't lose it easily. But why hasn't the great enemy that lured me into the trap appeared? Ever since Gong Qi had entered this maze of sand and dust, he had been vigilantly searching at all times, attempting to use his mental senses to detect traces of the enemy, but to no avail. On the other hand, when he spread out his spiritual senses, they were tightly restrained and sluggish. This made him have some guesses. He casually picked up a grain of sand that was spinning past and carefully observed it. This particle was shaped like a grain of sand, but under the probing of soul force, one could see that its structure was so complicated that it made one's eyes pop out. It seemed to meander, it seemed to be transparent, it seemed like a layer, it seemed like a beehive, it seemed like the masterpiece of a miniature sculptor. When he tried to analyze it further and let his soul power seep in, there was a force within the sand that resisted and melted. Soon the sand expanded slightly before shattering into even more indescribable fragments that mixed into the surrounding dust. He had seen this thing before. Gong Qi had already lived for nearly 100 years. He had experienced the vicissitudes of the 21st century, the age of distortion, the World War, the post-war revival, the construction of the inner world, and so on. The number of dead transcendents he had seen was several times more than the number of living transcendents. It wouldn't be a problem to say that he had seen and experienced a lot. His experience filled in his knowledge and helped him make judgments. Domain fragments. That's much more complicated, and there are far too many of them. Such strange objects weren't just 1 or 2 grains or 3 or 5 piles. Instead, they were scattered as far as the eye could see, boundless. Even if the crushed dust occupied an even vaster space, this quantity far exceeded the norm. Gong Qi tried to find the logic behind this, exceeding the norm, and he quickly came up with a few guesses. It was these guesses that caused unprecedented waves to arise in his mind. What is this? Snake Tongue's thoughts drifted into his mind. She relied on Gong Qi's infusion of vital energy to forcefully stabilize her mind and awaken. She didn't want to mention the matter of food and bait again. She could only focus her limited mind on the key elements in front of her. Fortunately, she was close to Gong Qi and received some radiation effects. Otherwise, she would only be able to open her eyes wide and be blind in this treacherous area. Her weak soul force simply wouldn't be able to probe forward. Gong Qi straightforwardly answered Snake Tongue's doubts. This is a domain fragment. Domain fragment. Snake Tongue was absent-minded for a moment. Soon after, she emphasized the words in front of her. That's right. It's exactly what you think. If an extraordinary formed and solidified a domain in his peak state, then he was forcefully killed and his domain shattered. What remains is this object. Gong Qi smiled and said, I heard that you grew up in the Hachiman Temple. Back then, the Amaterasu order swept through the archipelago. Those who complied with them flourished and those who opposed them perished. I don't remember who that person from the main temple was. It's said that he died in such a way. It seems that there are also such relics that are worshipped all year round. Perhaps you've seen them before. That's right. There were originally over 30 of them. However, they were the best divine objects for incantations. After repeated use over the years, they were eroded and worn away. When I left, there were less than 20 of them. Snake Tongue compared them to her memories. She matched them with great difficulty, but she was startled by the logic behind it. But there are too many here. According to this inference, how many extraordinaries had fallen in these scattered fragments? Hundreds? Thousands? Over 10,000? If this was truly the case, then all the extraordinaries since the era of distortion added together would be nothing more than a fraction. They might not all be the relics of extraordinaries. If it's a plane like the deep blue world or a half-plane of a lower rank, it's still unknown. Didn't some people say that in a certain sense, domains and planes can be equated? Take Ouyang Chen's so-called logic world for example. 100 or so exploded in one go. Perhaps it's on a similar scale. Perhaps we're in a shattered world fragment. Of course, there's bound to be an even more fundamental space-time structure outside the fragment. Otherwise, where would we find a place to stand? But even so, the rules of space-time have already been destroyed. It forms an enormous suppression on the strength of outsiders. It's a good place to set up an ambush. This level of knowledge already surpassed the scope of Snake Tongue's common knowledge. If she heard it on an ordinary day, she would certainly firmly remember it and think of every method to get to the bottom of it. But in this current situation, she could only remain silent. At this time, Gong Qi suddenly laughed. Amidst his laughter, he extended his hand. His lustrous and translucent spirit body structure sufficiently interfered with the sandstorm dust mist, rippling with spirit waves. After several attempts, he opened his mouth again. In any case, this is a secret land of enormous value. It can make all the apex scientists and research organizations that study spacetime and planes go crazy. If it were me, I would hide this place tightly and not reveal the slightest bit of it. Then I would devote myself to research. But that person's methods are incomprehensible. Such meticulous planning step by step and calculating our reactions perfectly. He's like a specter that hides by our side and monitors us for a long time. He knows our actions like the back of his hand and he plans to target us. It wouldn't be strange for such a person to play any tricks. But he just had to use this part of the world as a trap. Moreover, he didn't make his move the instant we stepped into the trap. We missed a great opportunity. Why? Snake Tongue's train of thought was already led away by Gong Qi. That's because Because his strength isn't enough. Gong Qi directly concluded. Perhaps that person's treacherous methods are impossible to guard against, causing people to unconsciously raise their judgment of him. But the methods of doing things can't replace the rhythm, especially the bright rhythm that belongs to the strong. It's possible that everything is linked together, but it definitely wouldn't be as sloppy as it is now. Clearly he's counting on this maze realm to reduce my strength. It's just a pity that he doesn't understand the matters of the extraordinary plane. Snake Tongue could feel that the identity of the person Gong Qi spoke of was already on the verge of being revealed. She wasn't willing to play the role of a supporting character, but the accumulated emotions dictated her words and actions. Even if it would be very difficult for her to leave this place alive, she still had to figure out the identity of the so-called Lord that was toying with her in the palm of his hand. Who is he? You still haven't figured it out? You need to properly adjust your mentality. In such a sealed environment, there shouldn't be any extra clues or extra people. Therefore the most likely person is the one that sent you here. Amidst the low voice, a vague image was imprinted in Snake Tongue's mind. The outline was gradually corrected and it gradually became clear. She was about to blurt it out. Of course, in her current state, a pure thought reaction was more direct. But at this moment the speed of the sand and dust in the surroundings suddenly increased. She originally had a tiny reaction from Gong Qi's spiritual wave radiation, but it was also disrupted. For Snake Tongue the surroundings darkened. She couldn't hear a single sound. It was as if her entire body had been thrown into an endless black hole. Her mind suddenly tightened. A second later, a dim ray of light flooded over and illuminated her surroundings once more. But the source of this radiating light was no longer from Gong Qi. At the very least it wasn't completely. At the border where the two layers of light interweaved, the fluttering sand and dust lost their usual trajectory. It seemed to ripple and distort as if it were being grabbed by some invisible hand and pulled inward. Sand and dust rubbed and collided with each other. It even stimulated leaping sparks, forming a dynamic chaotic scene of alternating light and darkness. And in this chaotic background, there were several relatively clear silhouettes condensed from the myriad grains of sand and dust. They formed the relief of a human face. The eyes and brows seemed familiar, and the fierce and penetrating rays of light directly illuminated her. Under the stimulation of the rays, Snake Tongue's disturbed thoughts suddenly took form. Chapter 783. Luonan. Snake Tongue obviously remembered Luonan. After all, it was this person who had thrown her into that misty world and trapped her in a city of worry. However, after spending half a year in the clouds, day by day, that person's face had more or less become a little blurry. She could only remember that he was a somewhat neurotic youth. His way of thinking was very different from ordinary people, and his mouth was full of strange theories. Moreover, when his emotions got the better of him, he could do anything. In Snake Tongue's mind, Luonan was a twisted and grotesque figure. He was similar to some sort of symbol representing a terrible road sign in her life. But at this moment, seeing the relief face condensed in the dust, the symbolic impression suddenly became much more real. At least, this work in the dust and the whole process of its manifestation was deeply engraved in his mind, and it was difficult to forget. An exciting appearance. Gong Qi's telepathic thoughts shuttled back and forth in the rays of radiation, on both sides, raising layers of tiny waves. Perhaps he wanted to disturb Luonan's sculpting process a bit, but in the end it didn't happen. This thought only turned into a cold and heavy voice, appearing in the dust storm. In half a year's time, the growth of a young man is always astonishing. Luonan could not tell if this was an evaluation or a conversation. In any case, Luonan did not pay attention to it. Or perhaps this human face relief did not possess the ability to converse. Just as the long silence was about to devolve into awkwardness, Gong Qi cleverly shifted the direction of the conversation to Snake Tongue. Illusions will always be shattered, right? Snake Tongue understood the meaning of White House's words. It was she, Tank, and a group of people who had burned the works of Luonan's mother. It was also Luonan's revenge that caused her to lose herself in the clouds and fall into her current predicament. She hated Luonan, and it was impossible for Luonan to forgive her. Given this premise, there wouldn't be the slightest bit of kindness in the fusion of spirit and body that gave her the greatest hope. Was it despair? Snake Tongue only remained silent. However, the silence was quickly broken by an external force. A thought that was different from Gong Qi's penetrated in and restored a familiar voice in their consciousness. I'm sorry. The delay in long-distance communication here is much longer than I thought. Luonan. Gong Qi's telepathic thoughts were severed as he responded. Sme. The so-called delay was completely absent from the conversation. Only the dust and sand billowed, and the human face relief in the middle steadily occupied a region. Moreover, it was obvious that a different kind of power had been injected into it. Even when the surrounding environment was in turmoil, it still showed very vivid details. This was especially so for the pair of eyes that were pieced together from an unknown amount of dust and sand. They opened and closed almost naturally as if they were shining with a cold light. They projected hatred and murderous intent without reservation. Oh, I shouldn't have been so polite. What I should say is, old thief Gong Qi, your time of death has come. Gong Qi wasn't easily provoked into anger. Luo Nan's words and actions were very much in line with the temperament of a young man. However, how could a guy who could endure for half a year to set up an ambush and successfully trick him into a trap be a simple teenager? He continued to sense the surrounding environment, probing the real situation and probing Luo Nan at the same time. Is there only you here? The human-faced relief only stared coldly. Gong Qi laughed involuntarily. Yes, I can imagine. For Ouyang Chen and Wu Jiong to take a fancy to him, there was no need to say more about his potential. From your ability to control this sandstorm, I can see about 70% to 80% of it. However, you're far from learning their magnanimity. You don't know how to share. Such a good place. Luo Nan's face within the dust and mist also laughed. He was most likely amused by Gong Qi's outlandish words. Share this world with you? What about Ouyang Chen and Wu Jiong? Gong Qi strode forward. He was clearly treading on nothingness, but it was as if he was walking on a shady path. He was calm and at ease, at least on the surface. I dare to assert that you absolutely haven't told Ouyang Chen and Wu Jiong about this secret. Otherwise I would have run into those two long ago. That's true. A smile was drawn on Luo Nan's human face relief. He faced Gong Qi, who was gradually approaching steadily and unwaveringly. Gong Qi spat softly. It's good for a young man to have perseverance and willpower, but if you do it too much you'll become stubborn. Take you for example. What's the point of hiding this secret? You're just a watchdog that guards the door and eats. I wasn't able to enter before, but now that I've entered, what can you do? Luo Nan's response had just begun when a green-gray radiance suddenly flashed above Gong Qi's spirit body, who was less than 20 meters away. It was as if a rainbow light blade had cut through the air. It sliced diagonally across the human face relief, cleaving it in half. The human face relief collapsed and the dust and mist sandstorm behind it exploded with a rumble. It formed a momentary turbulence, but it was immediately crushed by the even more tyrannical storm surrounding it. The exquisite work of relief was annihilated without a trace in the short span of a second. It really is a long-distance projection. But do you really think I can't see through your trick of crossing the sea and deceiving the heavens? The green-gray smoke flowed back around Gong Qi's body, swirling around his body. This was a layer of pure essence energy formed from the intersection of life and death. If Gong Qi could truly capture Luo Nan's location, regardless of whether it was his fleshly body or his spiritual body, Gong Qi would be able to pursue and infiltrate Luo Nan's body until Luo Nan died. As for that sneak attack that lacked the demeanor of an expert, he had already reached this point. Demeanor my ass. Gong Qi was already extremely decisive. Unfortunately, Luo Nan was much more cautious than he imagined. Luo Nan was also much more brilliant. Luo Nan was actually able to transmit power from a long distance within this sealed void. Luo Nan was even able to perform such exquisite work. From this, it could be seen that it seems that you've put quite a bit of effort into this maze realm for you to be able to twist the domain fragments into a flower. Moreover, there is certainly a special structural pattern. Did your arrangements in the surroundings come from this? But if you think that you can trap and kill me here with just this, you're indulging in the wildest fantasies. The green-gray smoke outside Gong Qi's body spread out once more as he spoke. Layer by layer, it seeped into the dust and mist sandstorm. Smoke and dust exploded everywhere it passed. Lightning was faintly discernible. It was vaguely similar to the scene of Luo Nan molding the human face relief. It was just that what Gong Qi made wasn't a tangible object that could be discerned with a glance. Instead, it was a layer of curtains that flowed along with the dust and mist sandstorm. The curtains were woven from domain fragments that were like dust and sand. What Gong Qi did was to eliminate the impurities and extract the essence, leaving behind only the structure that was useful to him. It wasn't as refined and detailed as Luo Nan's, but it had its own tyrannical laws lying across it. And all of this was under the control of Gong Qi's will. There are many things in the extraordinary level. Imagination alone is far from enough. Extraordinary domain. Snake Tongue recognized this powerful power that belonged exclusively to extraordinaries. She was also covered within the curtains. Although she was in her weakest state and her active perception was practically non-existent, she was still somewhat sensitive to the radiance radiating in from the outside world. The probing situation of radiation radiating from both sides revealed a one-sided situation the instant Gong Qi established his extraordinary domain. The radiance that came from Luo Nan was simply crushed and covered, no longer leaving a trace. But then again, that face and that penetrating, fierce and penetrating radiance still lingered in her mind. It wasn't destroyed by Gong Qi's oppressive power. In fact, it became even more vivid. He's still here. This thought inexplicably flashed through Snake Tongue's mind. Before she could find a basis for it, an external force acted upon her and manifested on the plane of consciousness. Indeed, there are some things that I don't quite understand. The curtains erected by Gong Qi weren't able to isolate Luo Nan's telepathic transmission. At most, they formed a few insignificant noises. From Snake Tongue's perspective, this couldn't even compare to the confusion created by Luo Nan's words. From my understanding, the strength of extraordinaries, yes, I'm talking about the mental side, is mostly built upon the powerful grasp of the energy storm of the abyssal region. Especially after establishing a solidified configuration. The stable and efficient energy utilization mode and interference mode can practically provide an inexhaustible amount of power. Constructing a so-called domain, with its own unique rules on this foundation is just a test of logical ability. Am I right? Snake Tongue's train of thought had already been blocked by special terms like the solidified configuration. In comparison, Gong Qi was able to understand without any hindrance by combining his own experience. But it was precisely because he understood that he couldn't help but be astonished. Luo Nan was still underage. For this type of up-and-coming talent, it was already outstanding for his soul strength to reach the middle zone. But why did this kid seem to be so familiar with the abyssal region? Half a second later, Gong Qi discovered that he was astonished too early. Actually, I don't really understand the mysteries of the abyssal region. I also don't know where that majestic power originates from. I only know that the abyssal region is densely covered with undercurrents, just like the boundless ocean of the deep sea. But the sea is vast and has a boundary. I don't really understand the definition of a boundary. I just know that the power of the Earth's abyssal region doesn't naturally extend to the clouds. Here's the problem, Deputy Secretary General Gong. According to my observations, you've been affected by the sealed spacetime. It's hard for you to utilize the solidified configuration of the Earth's abyssal region. Your strength has been affected a bit, but you haven't reconstructed your configuration in the Cloud End Abyss region. Even if it's only a temporary one. Why? Gong Qi was silent for a moment before asking in reply, yeah, why? I'll call you an old thief because you haven't given up on your evil intentions. Every day, you sense the aura of the solidified configuration that belongs solely to you within the Earth's abyssal region. You pass through the polar domain. That place is high up and illusory. It's transparent and unobstructed. It's like the vacuum of the atmosphere. It isn't obstructed by the barriers of space-time. Especially with the sun rising from the clouds these past few months. With a reference, your sense of direction should be much stronger, right? If I give you a few more months of time, who knows what you'll be able to do? Gong Qi didn't speak again. In this moment, he restrained all the meaningless reflections of his expression. He just stared with a heavy gaze at the howling dust mist and sandstorm outside the tent. It was as if he wanted to capture the image of Luo Nan's existence from within. Luo Nan's human face relief had been chopped to pieces by Gong Qi, but the lines of the young man's eyes and brows were carved into him bit by bit through these difficult and heart-piercing words. Some of them had even broken his flesh and splashed blood, burning with pain. Chapter 784. Was that really Luo Nan in front of him? Gong Qiling's thoughts interweaved and changed. He instinctively wanted to change his previous judgment. This was because what he had experienced so far had already broken away from the common sense constructed over the course of his nearly 100 years of life. A young man who had just stepped into the inner world circle, had a deep understanding of the abyss region and the polar realm. It could be explained as a parrot parroting, used specifically to deceive others. But how did Luo Nan accurately grasp the activity of his mental senses come about? Even if it was not completely correct, there was no problem in grasping the trend. Even Gong Qiling himself had never thought about how to grasp the movement trend of a mental type extraordinary without alarming the target. Aside from years of patient observation and meticulous analysis, there was certainly an extremely high-end observation method. Was there such a method in this world? Was that kid really just a little doggy who overestimated his own capabilities and protected his own food? Were the shadows of Ouyang Qin and Wu Jiong hiding behind him? That wasn't right. This wasn't the style of those two at all. Gong Qiling's thoughts were a chaotic mess for a time. There was no fixed conclusion. When he first came to Xia City, he had gone for the exchange of benefits. The 2000s of Deep Blue's shares and the absolute secret behind An Weng and the Order of Justice's actions were the things he valued. As for Luo Nan, he just happened to be in a crucial position. He needed to gather information from there. He did not place much importance on him. He just wanted to look at the information. Even though he had fallen into the cloud world and struggled to get out, he had no way of figuring out Luo Nan, a key character. Now that the two sides had collided, he confirmed once more that his understanding of this young man was far from enough. Especially when he relied on common sense and logic. It was hard for him to reach a normal conclusion. It was like he had bumped into a dense fog of nothingness. He was completely unable to ascertain what was inside. Perhaps it was empty. Perhaps it was filled with poison. Perhaps it was mixed together with the dust, fog, and sandstorm. The enemy knows me, but I don't know the enemy. There was nothing worse than this from a purely situational point of view. As his thoughts changed, the tent that was spread out within the dust, fog, and sandstorm slowly retracted, representing Gong Qiling's gradual change in attitude. He needed to gather more information. He needed to have more conversations with this young man. With this thought, the noise caused by the interference of the domain was greatly reduced, and the other's thoughts were transmitted again, seemingly ready to have a long talk. Actually, I feel that there is another reason why you haven't reconstructed your solid configuration in the cloud world, other than eliminating the interference. I'm not an extraordinary. This is just a wild guess. You can evaluate it and see if it's correct. Gong Qi appeared to be quite interested. Tell me about it. I'm just thinking that maybe Deputy Secretary General Gong wants to recreate the solidified configuration of the abyss area on Earth in this cloud world. But he's not willing to, but he can't. For a moment, the curtain that was floating in the dust storm froze. The manifestation of Luo Nan's telepathic thoughts grew clearer and clearer. It should be the effects and limitations of the fleshly body. According to the sparse knowledge I have regarding extraordinaries, the balance of the structure of body and soul, as well as the relationship of interference, are extremely important. Even for the mental side, the accumulation of the fleshly body is very necessary. Correspondingly, if I were to form a solidified configuration in the abyss region, both the body and the soul cannot be neglected. In this case, if the connection between body and soul is severed, it would be a rather troublesome matter to start anew. A single mishap would result in a conflict between the two and the foundation would be damaged. Therefore, you'd rather expend a bit more effort to temporarily organize and operate the structure in the clouds. You'd give up a few highly effective methods in order to ensure the purity of the foundation. This way you can avoid the consequences of creating an odd shape. Of course, these are all my guesses. I still need to verify them. Based on the principle of body and soul cannot be neglected, my spiritual body can't court death in the cloud world. My fleshly body can't cause any trouble on Earth. Admittedly, this is stable, but without stimulation the progress isn't too ideal. Speaking of which, Deputy Secretary General Gong has been away from Earth for half a year. Do you know what the situation is over there? What situation is Chan City? Yes, and what situation is the island where you're hiding in seclusion? Gong Qi's spiritual body's pupils congealed like ice when he heard these three situations. At this moment he even wanted to create an explosion and completely crush the young man who was still hidden behind the nothingness. But he didn't do that. The young man's thoughts were still transmitted, but it no longer turned into vibrating sound waves. Instead, it controlled some of the sand and dust as if it was going to remake the human face sculpture. Now it was going to look different. The outline of the image was zigzagging and disorderly. After spreading out, looking at the familiar distribution of land and sea, it was clearly a map of the world. Moreover, as the details were carved, the image gradually changed, showing more detailed and realistic curvature. A few seconds later, it had curled into the shape of a miniature Earth about 1/2 meter in diameter, spinning silently in the sky full of sand. Suddenly, the temporary globe stopped spinning, and the slightly concave area that corresponded to the Pacific Ocean was facing Gongqi. To be precise, it was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the seemingly inconspicuous archipelago area. After another 1/2 second, the entire sphere greatly swelled and deformed, thus achieving the effect of zooming, highlighting the details of a special area in the archipelago area. It's here, right? This is the feast that I've prepared for you for 1/2 a year. Please enjoy it. Boom! Gongqi finally did what he had always wanted to do. He created an astonishing explosion within the sandstorm of dust and fog, tearing apart the globe used for the demonstration. He also crushed everything within the range of his power, everything that was not pleasing to the eye. The problem was that no matter how berserk Gongqi unleashed within the misty labyrinth in the distant clouds, no matter how violent his attacks were, no matter how violent his emotions were, he was unable to find a way out before the barrier that separated the two places. The power he stirred up was destined to be unable to affect the local space-time of the Earth in the slightest. So Luonan's posture didn't change at all on the Ray yacht at Northern Mountain Lake. He really hadn't cast his true body, including his spiritual body, into the cloud world. He would rather spend a bit more energy to communicate with his projection. Gongqi's words were correct. It was impossible to trap and kill him like this, but there was still a follow-up. Luonan wasn't just trying to scare Gongqi. Lu quietly walked in and delivered fragrant coffee. At the same time she spoke by his ear, "The madam has already arrived at the predetermined location." "I know." Luonan looked at the time displayed in the lower right corner of the projection area. Today was May 2nd, Thursday. It wasn't a special day. The students of Acumen College were all in class, and he was quite unqualified as an older brother. He urged his little sister to skip class. Ruiwen had arrived at the underground laboratory of gear early in the morning. She had organized all of her equipment, and when Luonan's command was issued, she held onto the assembly box that was taller than her head. She lowered her head slightly. She abandoned her own senses at this moment, allowing Luonan's soul cloak's vast field of view to replace her. She relied on the soul cloak's positioning to lock onto the location of the volcanic archipelago in the middle of the ocean from a distance of 8,000 kilometers away. Chapter 785. In April and May, Chan City was considered the lightest season of the year. The dry season had just begun, so hurricanes were rare. The seas on the island were calm and there were very few tourists. Even the most deadly rush tide was missed. Because of this period of time was affectionately called seclusion season by the members of the headquarters. Since the end of March, a considerable number of ability users had applied to enter Volcano Island for seclusion. It wasn't overcrowded, but at the very least the seclusion rooms on the island, especially those high-quality areas, were in short supply. These days were painful and happy for the senior security expert Wolf, who was also the head of the security team. He would always miss the best time for cultivation because of the heavy duty on duty, but he would get some extra benefits because of his key position. Relying on this unique circumstance, he became a veteran B-class expert. However, perhaps it was also because of this circumstance that he was still a veteran B-class expert. It was currently the middle of the afternoon in Chan City. The weather wasn't too good. It had been raining since the morning. It was different from the torrential rain that usually passed by in a moment during the day. The rain was intermittent. Wolf felt a bit uncomfortable after being cooped up in his room for a long time. He took his two subordinates and patrolled the island reef area, checking the security equipment and the situation of the enchantments. The island reef area was filled with powerful people from the society and various powers of the inner world. Many people had taboo when it came to cultivation, so there were all kinds of restricted areas. Things like entering and flying were prohibited. The rules were very strict. Even the security team had to follow them. It wasn't easy for them to walk around, so they relied on idle chatter to get by. Before this, the hot headlines of Xia City and Saga City had given them something to talk about. They also calculated that with the speed of the flying devil ray, it would only take 2.5 hours to get from Xia City to Chan City. Next, Assistant A gestured on the security zone map. While chatting, he pointed out, "Luckily, Langdon can finally avoid the 13th zone this year." Assistant B whistled. "Then after the qualification test he'll have to find a new number. How tiring." Wolf knew the tricks of his two assistants, so he said, "Next we'll go to the 13th zone." Assistant A and Assistant B groaned, "Captain, for the sake of the weather. We'll go through the 13th zone and pass quickly." The two assistants' worries turned into joy. Oh, smart, no brilliant. Repairing equipment in wards had always been hard work. The equipment was fine, but when it came to high-end wards, well, it was more popular nowadays to call it configuration knowledge. It always gave the security team a headache. Wolf was an expert in this field. He knew the importance of daily patrols for security work, but since there was no one in District 13 this year, there was no need to torture his subordinates. The patrol was coming to an end. The three of them chatted as they moved forward. They naturally talked about the reason why the 13th sector was empty this year. Assistant A casually clicked on last month's report. It's been more than 4 months. The legendary plane is still a legend. Volcanic Island's quarterly income has dropped by almost 5%. Now those bosses would rather drink the wind in the Pacific Ocean than come back to meditate and train. Rolf calmly replied, "High-level seclusion areas are still in short supply. Moreover, extraordinaries can use it for free, but B-class and below don't have such treatment." "Hey Captain, year-end performance has nothing to do with rent. In terms of consumables, extraordinaries crush architects. Architects are also different from awakened ones. But you have Langdon. Not just one Langdon." This sentence made Assistant A choke back his complaints. Rolf didn't say anything more. If he continued, it would involve the security team's gray income area, which wouldn't be good for anyone. He had been on duty at Volcanic Island for 3 years. It was very likely that he would be transferred at the end of the year or early next year. There was no need to be the bad guy for this kind of thing. He returned to the topic of searching for a new plane. In the South Pacific region, there are endless clues about a new plane. Deputy Secretary General Gong's aura is like this rain, appearing and disappearing. It's said that there are also traces of ape-like creatures unique to that plane. It's only right for the boss to go and search. At least it can shut those busybodies up. Assistant A was a bit gossipy. "Along the way, I heard that Toyama Auction House is very generous. Will President Abner and the others attend the Jade Lights High Seas auction?" "Toyama doesn't have that much influence. But someone did." Rolf gave an ambiguous answer and then said, "Because of this, Chan needs 2 more layers of blankets when it catches a cold. There are city guards in the main city, but there's only us on Volcanic Island. If any mutated reptiles crawl in..." Assistant B shuddered. "It will face the anger of hundreds of architects and even extraordinaries. If they do, I can deduct your performance right now." Pretend I didn't say anything. Assistant B also shut up. The corner of Rolf's mouth twitched. In the end, he couldn't help but complain. "The association needs to hire a professional manager for Volcanic Island. How about poaching from intercontinental hotels?" Due to the special function of Volcanic Island, there was a phenomenon of the strength of the users and the defenders here being inverted. The security team inevitably changed to a service type, providing consumables, maintaining the barrier, and at most providing the first wave of warnings. In short, he was just an assistant. His responsibility was greater than the heavens, but the one doing the work was an ant. It was fine if nothing happened, but once something did happen, he would be the scapegoat. No matter how rich the gray income was, Rolf did not have any attachment to it. After chatting for a while, he thought of business. "Remember the partial upgrade in 2 days? How could I forget this?" Assistant B bent his finger. "Upgrading Mr. Gong Chi's seclusion area. The constructor is Ms. Dollar and the inspector is President Abner. There are 3 extraordinaries. Choose one out of the 3. No matter which one you choose to provoke, it'll be a dead end." "But isn't this a compulsory topic?" Assistant A responded coldly. It said that Mr. Gong seemed to have chewed a large piece of raw mustard at the consultation meeting last week. If Deputy Secret Director Gong comes back, it might be our turn to eat mustard. At this point, the conversation became a little awkward. They all knew that the so-called upgrade of the seclusion area was the installation of visual monitoring and interference precision perception systems. In other words, it was to carry out omnidirectional surveillance without any blind spots. Be it in terms of privacy or safety, this was unacceptable to any seclusion person, let alone Gong Qi, the Deputy Secretary General of the association. However, Gong Qi had been in seclusion for too long. It was almost certain that his soul had left his body and entered another plane. What was left in the seclusion area was only an empty shell of a physical body. In this state, he couldn't raise any objections. And under the stimulation of the benefits of the new plane, the attitudes of his various relatives, friends, and allies became more and more ambiguous. Until the upgrade motion was passed. Regarding this, Wolf, the natural scapegoat, was worried. I hope the end of the plane incident can be delayed. It would be more appropriate for me to resign next year. Of course, if there was a breakthrough in these 2 days, there wouldn't be a need for this. It would be a perfect dream. Sighing, he raised his head and a dark red stream of light flashed above his head. He made a wish at the shooting star. Huh? Wolf's eyes widened to the point that raindrops dripped into his eyes. Yes, there were still dark rain clouds above his head, but that light, his bracelet vibrated, and the security warning system lit up with a yellow light, which meant that a non-direct threat was approaching or had been nearby. Wolf raised his head and spoke to his men in the duty room. Report the target. Boss, a high-energy ray shot down from the sky, brushed past the no-fly zone in the 4th zone, and drilled into the bottom of the sea. It's about 30 kilometers away from the island's warning line. Maybe it's a high-power laser. Is there any damage to the barrier? There's a hole, but it can repair itself. Ask Chan's garrison if there are any related exercises. Definitely not, or we would have received the news. What about the Star Alliance? Their space fleet? When those people were cleaning up the space junk, the main cannon would occasionally fire. At least that's what the public report said. The military committee's consultation platform is habitually disconnected. Oh damn. The man in the duty room spoke more quickly. There's a strong reaction at the bottom of the sea. The energy index, no, there's interference reaction at the swamp area. The instrument average is 1.7 dg and the extreme is 2.3 d. Preliminary estimate is a fully evolved B-class mutant. Beside him, Assistant A said, if it's a B-class individual, there's no threat. Mutants often pass through the surrounding waters. Maybe they were stimulated by the laser? Maybe. Wolf was already numb to these kinds of things. He didn't even need to think, and a plan popped up in his mind. The self-healing of the barrier is too slow. Group 4, deal with it. As for the sea, take the image first and prepare the inducer. It's best if there's no conflict. But if there are some ladies and gentlemen who like specimens, we can consider it later. As he spoke, the originally pitter-patter of rain became heavier, and a thin layer of fog had appeared between the islands. The wind blew the rain and the fog assaulted their faces, slightly obscuring their vision. Wolf exhaled with the intention of blowing the fog away, but for some reason, the flow of the fog was not disturbed at all. It was a strange contrast to the strands of rain that were deflected by the force. Wolf was stunned. He suddenly felt a sense of déjà vu, as if he had experienced this before. It was also at this moment that the underwater camera equipment set up in the distant waters moved into position and transferred the image of the mutant that had suddenly appeared over. The moment the image appeared, Wolf made a clear judgment. This thing doesn't look like a marine mutant. It looks more like a big ape. As soon as this thought rose and fell, the ape creature with a body as dark as blood leaped into the sea and instantly escaped from the surveillance area. At this time, the man in the duty room followed up with a report. The target mutant jumped out of the sea. It's calling. There was no need for his subordinate to say anything more. Wolf could already capture the powerful shockwave that was pressing in from afar. It wasn't just the energy transmission of air molecules, but a powerful turbulence that involved the level of the swamp area. It had astonishing penetrative power. Even though it was weakened by the barrier of the islands during the transmission process, there were still aftershocks that seeped through. For a moment, the security system's alarms rang incessantly. It was unknown how many barriers and warning systems in sensitive areas were activated. Chapter 786. That ape was provoking him. Maybe the lasers from the sky had disturbed its sweet dreams, or maybe it was some other inexplicable reason. Whatever it was, the ape's attitude was very unfriendly, and it had brought Wolf a lot of trouble. At this time he had already forgotten where his sudden thoughts were pointing. More than 30 alarm signals converged into the security system at the same time. It was as if a great enemy was invading. In each of the seclusion areas, some of the more sensitive residents began to inquire the duty room, some sent out detectors and some even called Wolf directly. The continuous vibration of the wristband disturbed his pulse, and the flashing names that could not be messed with almost gave him a heart attack. Reset the warning signal system. Also F*King Inducer. Team 1, get rid of that thing. Before he finished, a roar that connected the abyss and the material plane boomed over again, obviously causing another wave of chaos. Assistant B slapped his forehead. That ape must be in heat. It's an ape-like creature because I don't see a tail. Assistant A's biological foundation was obviously more solid, and it was one of the words he said that stirred Wolf's emotions again. He suddenly stopped and turned to stare at Assistant A. Say it again, the one in front. I don't see a tail. Further ahead? Ape-like creature. It was a simple phrase, but it was like a bolt of lightning striking Rolf's mind. The rumor hidden in the depths of his memory was reflected together with the current situation. Ape-like creatures, new dimension, ape-like creatures. What? Because the topic was too sudden, the two assistants did not understand immediately. Wolf did not care about them. The rumored clue that appeared in the South Pacific region, why would it be here? But then again, it was meaningless to think about these reasons now. After all, this was the place where the clue to the new dimension first appeared. So what if they fought a cycle in half a year? Wolf did not think about the complicated factors behind it. He only knew one thing. This was a pie falling from the sky. He raised his wrist abruptly and through the wristband he ordered Team 1, who should have gone out to hunt. Capture it alive, we must capture it alive. I'll be right there. Before he could finish, Wolf suddenly choked. It was as if a thin electric current had swept across his scalp, and his hair stood on end. Under the gloomy sky, a circle of jade-green light clearly lit up, causing the sky to lose its original color. That was the result of the activation of the main enchantment buried on the volcanic island. The control of the main barrier was still in Rolf's hands, and he definitely did not give the order to activate it. Aside from President Abner, there was also Madame Dale. For the sake of the project that would take place 2 days later, she did stay on the volcanic island and was the first to notice the change. The report from the duty room came 2 seconds late. Wolf did not say anything. He only asked the other side to turn on the panoramic image formed by many observation points. It could be seen that the green spiritual light of the barrier that the important areas of the islands and reefs were giving off was concentrated on the surface of the sea, like a bunch of grapes that had just been picked and placed on a grayish-blue porcelain plate. They were translucent and seemed to be alive. Compared to a few seconds ago, the strength of the barrier was more than 10 times stronger. Moreover, as everyone knew, as the top barrier grandmaster in the inner world, Madame Constance Dale was never a conservative person. Compared to hiding in the barrier and passively resisting, she preferred to use unimaginable barrier spells to set up an inescapable net and hunt to her heart's content. From Rolf's point of view, under the gloomy sky, there was a dark golden light twisting and turning. After it took shape, it rapidly enlarged. It could be seen that it was the mysticism symbol of a single circle pentagram. With this symbol as the core, dozens of identical yet different circles extended in all directions. They were connected by straight lines and arcs of light, and there were also indecipherable runes flowing among them. This strange, gorgeous, and complicated diagram instantly connected the energy passageway between the spiritual and material planes. The turbulent storms of the abyss area and the ceaseless flow of energy in the material world converged here. Even from dozens of kilometers away, one could vaguely feel that the flow of air and the waves of the seawater had instantly become stagnant. It was as if the legendary time-stop magic had been cast. It was a treacherous contrast to the surrounding area. If the sea and the void were like this, then there was no need to mention the monkey. No, the ape-like creature trapped within. The provocative howl came to an abrupt end. Madame Dale has made her move. The team leader of Team 1 reported in a suppressed voice. He unconsciously exerted force, causing his voice to tremble. We can't go through. Stay where you are. No, stay further away. Rolf looked up at the sky and sighed. An extraordinary had actually made her move so quickly. He had wanted to capture the large ape that he suspected to be a creature from the new dimension and fight for some credit. Now it seemed that Madame Dale was indeed one of the few powerhouses in the society. She was much sharper and more decisive than a middle-level cadre like him. Since she was the one who had made a move to snatch the pie, Rolf could only extinguish that thought. He quickly adjusted his position and positioned himself as a support to make up for any mistakes. He quickly found Madame Dale's number and dialed it without hesitation. Thank you for your help, Madame Dale. I believe you must have discovered the close relationship between the ape-like creature and the new dimension. Halfway through his sentence he heard a cold snort from the other side. Rolf's heart twitched. He did not know how he had offended her. The light in the corner of his eyes changed. When he turned his head he saw that on the distant sea surface, a bloody light was leaping. With a dazzling trajectory, it forcefully broke through the restraints of the time-stop zone and escaped into the distant sky. In the process, every inch of the trajectory of the light represented evaporation and melting damage. The amount of bloody light that flew into the clouds was reduced by at least half compared to when it was at its peak. But the reality was that the large ape, which had been defined as a weapon in hand, still forcefully passed through the temporary barrier cage in the outer sea of the volcanic island and disappeared from everyone's line of sight. Tisk, how embarrassing. Madame Dale's self-deprecating expression combined with her usual gloomy temperament made Rolf want to slap himself in the face. He did not know what to say after that. But Madame Dale herself did not end the call. Instead, she analyzed the conversation in a chatting manner. That large ape interferes in both the spiritual and material planes. The structure of its body and soul is fully mixed. It should have achieved 100% energy transformation, so its speed is beyond common sense. Ordinary barriers can't trap it. This kind of aberration creature is very rare. The corner of Rolf's mouth twitched. He unconsciously straightened his body. It is very rare. It suddenly appeared in the sea? Maybe it's because of the stimulation of the high-energy laser. Rolf quickly gave a brief introduction of the previous situation for reference. And just as he was speaking from the direction of Chan City, another ray of light soared into the sky and rushed over here. It was unknown which extraordinary with the ability to fly had come to join in the fun. Madame Dale snorted again. The mysterious structure that was originally suspended in the sky above the sea suddenly disappeared. The light of the volcanic island's barrier also began to fade. Perhaps this female extraordinary had already gone far away to chase after the large ape. Connie, everyone who sees this has a share. There weren't many people in Chan City who dared to directly call Madame Dale Dale. Rolf vaguely recognized the voice of Vice President Marin. Although he could not see any trace of Madame Dale Dale, Marin's traveling light was heading straight for the open sea. Clearly the competition and pursuit had already begun. The pie flew away. Wolf subconsciously grinned. The meaning behind his smile was complicated. He subconsciously took 2 steps forward. Originally he wanted to return to the duty room to make arrangements. However, the surging clouds and blowing rain around him were getting thicker and thicker, almost blocking the road under his feet. There was also an even more wonderful feeling of emptiness. It once again disturbed the thoughts that had previously almost disappeared. That sense of déjà vu reappeared, and it easily added the most crucial element now. Rolf's body stiffened. His memories from a few months ago flowed back. I did indeed experience this scene. Although I was on the periphery at the time, this strange feeling of the surging clouds, as if I was high in the clouds, was something I experienced half a year ago. He could confirm that President Abner, the priestess of the Order of Justice, and Old Ho who had just eaten mustard were in the core area at that time. The feeling of confusion caused by the surrounding rain and mist was disassembled and reassembled at this moment. The corresponding logical chain finally connected in the void. A new plane. Wasn't this the projection of a new plane? Before he could truly experience the thrill of a clear mind, the wristband flashed with yellow light again. Today was truly a day of apprehension. A subordinate in the duty room reported loudly, "Captain, there's an abnormal vibration in Area 1. Area 1? Rolf blinked. Suddenly he shuddered again. Seclusion room Gongqi? The ground beneath his feet suddenly trembled. In the next moment, a dazzling red light shone from the wristband. The security system exploded with the highest level of alarm. The light in the room was dim. Only the life support system's instrument lights flickered, faintly illuminating the naked human bodies in the cabin. The air temperature here was more than 10 degrees lower than the outside world. Acumen College's spring and autumn uniforms seemed a bit thin. Ruiwen didn't care at all. She immersed herself in assembling. The structure she assembled was the same as the transmission array used on Northern Mountain Lake. The little girl's movements were skilled. She had practiced similar tasks countless times. The various structures of the transmission array had been maximized to the point of being modular, but clanking sounds were unavoidable when assembling. There was absolutely no lack of an automatic alarm system in this seclusion room. Soon the special situation was reflected in the security system. But the turmoil in the outside world, especially the automatic reset of the warning system, effectively concealed the unforeseen event here. Ruiwen concentrated on the work in her hands. According to Luo Nan's original plan, Ruiwen had nothing to do with this territory. It was more of a gambling type of power. But now that the research and configuration were complete, the links were a bit more complicated, but the reliability was increasing. The key was the transmission array and the safeguard was Ruiwen. It's about to begin. Luo Nan's telepathic thoughts were transmitted over. At nearly the same time, a dark red glow as thin as a thread penetrated through the void. It fell straight onto the centermost warehouse of the quiet room. They were separated by a hair's breadth, but there were fine ripples. Chapter 787. It was quite normal for an extraordinary to set up an enchantment within the seclusion grounds. At Gongqi's level, it was impossible for anyone to completely entrust their lives to the so-called security team. This was a variable that Luo Nan could imagine, but he was powerless to do anything about. At least this was the case before he revised his plan. The slender red beam collided with the enchantment like a high-energy laser. It scorched the barrier, but the work of breaking the barrier did not proceed smoothly. The enchantment was nearly invisible, but it was built upon the foundation of Gongqi's powerful fleshly body. It integrated with the abundant energy reserves of the seclusion area through an exquisite circulation of energy. It could be called the pinnacle of enchantment technology in the inner world. Perhaps the enchantment was limited by the way it was operated, so it could not be maintained for a long time. However, it took into consideration all sorts of unexpected situations that might occur during the period of seclusion. Its bearing capacity for the first wave of impact was quite astonishing. Its purpose was to resist the instantaneous damage of an extraordinary. The hidden structure of the incorporeal enchantment was revealed under the scorching of the slender beam of light. The precise and complex structural diagram flickered indefinitely. Its circulation was still strict, constantly digesting and transferring the impact force it was withstanding. The impact from the polar domain did not reach its upper limit, but the follow-up energy still had to bear an even more important task. If the energy was excessively consumed here, it would be very difficult to achieve the desired goal of Gongqi's tough and sturdy fleshly body. What was even worse was that the life support system had triggered the highest level of alarm the moment it received the impact. It had also activated the forced awakening mechanism. Of course, Gongqi's soul was currently in an out-of-body state and he was imprisoned in the cloud world. He could not wake up. However, the floor beneath the cockpit had already split open. The mechanical installation drove the cockpit to rapidly sink. In the blink of an eye, the middle and lower parts of the cockpit had already sunk beneath the floor. The split opening wasted no time at all and began to close up. The life support system only needed a second and a half to sink into a permanent fortification capable of withstanding the attack of an Earth-penetrating missile. Whoosh! Ruiwen, who had been assembling the transmission array ahead, let out a sigh of relief. She stopped what she was doing and breathed out. She switched to working mode and swung her arm. It was as if an incorporeal blade slashed through the air, producing a hissing sound. The impact instantly struck the enchantment outside the cockpit. It appeared to be a sharp slash, but what it embodied was not penetrative power. When the collision occurred, the originally strict internal structure of the barrier seemed to have been replaced with a high-power engine that had been installed with an accelerator, causing it to hum and spin wildly. The situation was like a truck that was fully loaded with goods. It was moving at a steady and uniform speed, but in the blink of an eye, It had entered the territory of a sports car. Moreover, it was still accelerating and the brake system had completely malfunctioned. Even if there was a boundless plane in front of it, the changes in the flow that exceeded the limits of what it could endure also accelerated the wear and tear of the entire system. Structural links accelerated and lost speed one after another, and the tight structure began to distort and deform until it was completely out of shape. Half a second ago, the barrier that was hard to break was like a balloon that was filled with water. With a bang, it exploded and the scattered spiritual waves swept through the entire quiet room. It also brought with it an even sharper alarm. This secluded quiet room was completely filled with flashing red light. But no matter what, the shattering of the barrier determined the course of events. On the upper edge of the cockpit that had already sunk halfway, a small opening was silently eroded open. The fine red light drilled in through this small hole and firmly hit the forehead of Gongqi, who was sleeping with his eyes closed inside the cockpit. Beautifully done. A praise came from the distant void. At the same time, there were indistinctly discernible howls and roars in the background. It was slightly chaotic. Ruiwen still didn't turn her head. She just quietly switched back to her work mode and continued with the finishing touches on the work at hand. As for the cockpit, the translucent nutrient fluid suddenly turned turbid. Then a large number of air bubbles surged until it boiled. Flames. Blood-red flames ignited from between Gongqi's eyebrows. They quickly burned through his closed eyelids, and then came out from his nostrils, mouth and ear orifices. From point to surface, from head to toe, they covered his entire body. Under the raging blood-red flames, Gongqi's tough body, which didn't show any signs of aging, began to distort and swell. What changed even faster was the gases in the cockpit that were exploding. The cockpit even burst open, and then the escape passage that led downwards was firmly stuck. The floor that was about to close up was also stuck there. The mechanical force and the dissimulated life force that was wreaking havoc in the cockpit clashed so powerfully that the entire floor of the room began to shake violently. Of course, this could also be due to the repeated bombardment of this area by the security team outside and the few extraordinaries who had finally come back to their senses. The seclusion quiet room hidden deep beneath the island began to collapse. The powerful mental attacks from at least 2 different extraordinaries also squeezed through the outer protective barrier, crushing inside layer by layer. The room could collapse at any moment, but Ruiwen didn't care in the slightest. She just lowered her head and used the testing apparatus Luonan gave her to inspect the error of the transmission array to see if it was within the permitted range. An explosive boom rang out and the shattered parts of the cockpit sprayed out from the gaps in the floor. Without the obstruction, the 2 somewhat deformed floors finally closed together. But they only closed for half a second before the berserk power from below blasted them apart in one fell swoop. Blood-colored flames rose from the ground, illuminating the entire quiet room. They suppressed the flickering red light of the alarm. It was as if an invisible brush was sketching and smearing within the flames. Mountain ramparts, winding rivers of blood, cave temples and so on gradually took form. Together they constructed a treacherous picture of a lonely peak. After this picture of a lonely peak, the outline of a human body gradually became clear. It seemed to have condensed into some sort of liquid substance. It warped endlessly, gradually taking shape. The island structure that the quiet room was built on began to collapse at an accelerated rate. And the existence within the bloody flames that seemed human yet inhuman walked over in Ruiwen's direction with heavy footsteps. Ruiwen remained unresponsive. The flaming humanoid brushed past Ruiwen's body. It walked all the way to the metal chest that she had brought with her before, the chest that had already been mostly dismantled. There was still a set of mechanical components that Ruiwen had not touched within the chest. As the flaming humanoid drew closer, the drifting tail of flames swept across the metal chest outside. High heat was transmitted over, and what burst out from the chest was a deep blue electric flame. The glow of the barrier of the volcanic island had just dimmed, but it shone once more. This time the deep blue color of the barrier had turned quite a bit deeper. It was suffused with a purplish-red luster. Warped runes revolved within each large grape, and they passed through the internal pipes to transmit a majestic power to the location of Area 1. The barrier of that area clearly could not withstand this power. Just as it was about to collapse, it was forcefully controlled by Madame Delay. The structure of the barrier suddenly changed from defending against external forces to suppressing and sealing inward. This was Madame Delay's habitual method, but the other spiritual type extraordinary who stood across from her was Canon Monroe, who was famous for his long-range firepower. He was clearly not pleasing to the eye. "You've covered this place so tightly that I can't even use my hands and feet. There's a conflict between our soul forces again. You're disturbing me." Ever since the rise of the cage theory, a certain genius youth's theory of assault had also become widespread. An old hand like Monroe loved this sort of joke the most. From time to time he would play around with it. Using it on a strong person of the opposite sex at the same level gave him an exceptional sense of accomplishment. Madame Delay always wore a thick robe that covered her body and a hood that covered her head. She looked like a mysterious witch from the Middle Ages. She couldn't be bothered to bicker with the old bastard Monroe, nor would she change her most habitual way of doing things. She turned a deaf ear to Monroe's protests. Moreover, they had already wasted too much time. Above the two spiritual type extraordinary, Vice President Marin's brows were tightly furrowed. He was rather anxious in his heart. Abner was away, and as the first vice president he was the one in charge. If something were to happen it would be a great loss of face. This was a bad omen. Marin was a pure physical extraordinary. Mental senses weren't his forte, but his spiritual senses were sharp and his intuition was astonishing. He instinctively felt that the situation in Area 1 and Gongqi's situation were very bad. However, that old fellow had always been untrustworthy. He had set up too many defensive measures in his seclusion room, and now they had all become fatal obstacles. But these defensive measures were all intact, so where did the danger inside come from? "I'll go in." Impatience finally wore away the last bit of Marin's patience. It also burned away the arrogance of his status. His figure sank down. He wanted to use the most direct and skilled method to directly penetrate the barrier and figure out the problem inside. As for whether or not Gongqi would have any objections after this, he would wait until he had a future to think about it. Marin's thoughts were clear. His tyrannical body propelled an inconceivable force, and he crashed down like a meteorite falling from the sky. Even Madame Delay, who controlled the barrier, had to make way for him. But the moment his body passed through the barrier, Marin's rapidly descending body suddenly came to a halt. The two spiritual type extraordinaries in midair also reacted at the same time. All three of them stopped what they were doing and turned their heads to look at the sky. In the gaps between the gloomy and heavy clouds above the volcanic island, dark blue waves of light suddenly flashed and leaped. The surrounding clouds seemed to have turned into a strange lantern. Intense light flickered inside and leaped about. In the end, it tore apart the fragile outer skin and sprayed out dazzling electric flames. And in the eyes of the three extraordinary, when the electric flames tore apart the clouds, there was a powerful force field that shouldn't have appeared. It tore apart the barrier between the abyss area and the material world at the same time, allowing the spiritual and material planes to fully interfere. Moreover, it set up an invisible guideway that locked onto the target of the berserk energy. Rumble. The sound of thunder came from the horizon, and the rapidly expanding air stirred restlessly in the void. But what spread at a speed thousands of times faster than this powerful vibration were the three electric spears that shot down from the clouds. Chapter 788. At this moment, the situation on the physical plane on Volcano Island was soul-stirring. However, on the corresponding abyssal zone, the possibility of most spectators being spectators was immediately eliminated. At present, the abyssal zone had completely turned into a destructive windstorm. The collision of the transcendent level forces and the explosion of each force affected the magnificent power of the torrents in the abyss zone. Impact and recoil, control and loss of control. Under the high-speed confrontation on the mental plane, under the pressure of a powerful opponent, even extraordinaires could not take care of every detail. As a result, the level of chaos continued to increase. The accumulated violent power swept from top to bottom, sweeping through every level that people could reach with their thoughts. Even a veteran B-rank powerhouse like Rolf could not recover from the impact of the lightning spear. He was so shocked by the surrounding void that it was as fragile as thin paper that he found it hard to breathe. He was afraid that a moment of carelessness would cause the barrier to break and the abyssal zone's torrent to flood out, wiping out the entire security team. Rolf was already like this. As a participant in the battle, the pressure was even more astonishing. The high-level attack and defense of the abyssal zone needed to draw out a relatively clear vein in the deep chaos that continued to increase. With great control, the direction of the battle would not be greatly deviated. The problem was that Madame Delay and the others had made a mistake in their judgment from the beginning. The lightning spear that had been thrown down seemed to be an explosive attack. It was indeed so at the beginning, but only when it was truly received did it reveal the exquisite structure and operation mode hidden deep within the abyssal zone. That was the continuous lashing of the long whip and the iron chain. The enormous power from the abyss, under the effect of the extremely efficient mode, came and went one after another. The bright light and the dark thunder were almost endless, not giving them any chance to catch their breath. The best way and also the only way to deal with it was to endure this round of impact and then plan again. Of course, the three extraordinaires were not really suppressed to the point that they could not breathe. Malin, who was not good at psychic sensing, could still give orders. Electromagnetic ability. What's the situation below? The two spiritual-type extraordinaires had already sent their thoughts into the seclusion area. They intertwined and swept through the area, and they also found something. Madame Delay said, "The palace life support cabin is broken, and the remains are missing." Monroe followed closely. "That guy is equipped with an exoskeleton armor and is hiding his head and tail. Furthermore, he managed to conceal his aura. It seems like he was setting fire earlier. The form of the burning seems to be somewhat familiar." According to the cage theory, the current situation was more or less a situation where the two parties were attacking each other at the same time. Everyone could take part of the initiative, but no one could seize more opportunities to win. Of course, Marlin and the other two were on the same side, but to effectively work together in the abyssal zone storm that had erupted in an instant, they still needed to constantly adjust. The problem was that the other party was also constantly changing. It wasn't the kind of inevitable trend towards chaos, but rather a subtle reverse effect. Strange. Menluo couldn't help but add. In the process of colliding and bombarding each other, the chaos in the abyss area would increase exponentially every second. Hundreds and thousands of variables would appear every second. They were huge in number and lacked connection, thus bringing about greater interference. Of course, the combatants had to do their best to eliminate the interference. The problem was that the strong control of soul power would cause the other side to become even stronger while suppressing a portion of the changes. After all, power was always interacting with each other, and no one could completely transcend the abyss and exist independently. Everyone could only evaluate and calculate based on experience. It would be too flattering to say that it was calculation. Most of the time it was still using experience, half-guessing and half-guessing. In this way, combatants like Menluo, while the stirring power was getting stronger and stronger, their control basically showed a smooth downward trend. The power of extraordinaries was reflected in the word, smooth. If it were anyone else, their control would only fall precipitously. This was the reason why certain rank B spiritual-type attacks and defenses in the abyss area were often 3-second men. What made Menluo feel strange was that the other party's operating efficiency in the abyss area didn't decrease after every round of explosive increase in variables. Instead it increased. At first, Menluo, including Madame Delay and Marlin, thought that the other party was doing a vicious cycle of forceful reinforcement, so they waited for the other side to run out of power before counterattacking. But now they finally realized that the other party wasn't increasing in power, but in efficiency. In the chaos of exponential growth, the efficiency of power integration was constantly increasing, and the rate of improvement was getting faster and faster. The extent of accumulation was also getting more and more obvious. The consequence of a wrong judgment was that they had missed the other party's rhythm. In other words, they had completely lost the initiative. Marlin growled. In the attack and defense of the abyss area, his physical side was relatively marginalized, but it was also easy to adjust. As a physical side, he had to be aware of it. He didn't hesitate to take damage and act as a sharp knife to counterattack, forcefully interrupting the other party's strange rhythm. Under the impetus of Marlin's powerful will, which was almost tangible, his physical body's blood energy was forcibly increased, and with a burning posture he achieved the resonance of the body and soul structure, interfering with the spiritual plane. Based on the foundation of stable matter, the blood energy was like a flying mountain, forcibly suppressing the almost irreversible chaotic situation in the abyss area. This kind of momentum couldn't last long, but it had the power to turn the situation around with a surprise attack. At least that was what Madame Delay and Menluo thought. They also used the momentum to counterattack. However, the other party retreated. That's right, they retreated. When Marin had forcefully interrupted them and Delay and Monroe were about to counterattack, the thunderbolts and lightning bolts had all retreated. Moreover, it separated from Marlin and the other two at the same time. At the same time, three extraordinaries, three different ability natures and rhythms. The difference in separation was simply measured in microseconds. It was precisely because of this precise uniformity that they didn't have the chance to stick together again. They left as soon as they said they would, and the Abyss Area's reaction instantly turned to zero. This is impossible. Men Luo cried out involuntarily. He had always been known as a long-range firepower on the spiritual plane. He was powerful, but he was lacking in exquisiteness. The instantaneous difference he felt was also the most obvious. In the Abyss Area's chaotic environment, this kind of observation and the corresponding exquisite microcontrol technique had already exceeded the limits of his common sense. How did he do it? Marlin was stunned for half a second. Compared to the opponent's microsecond level of error, using his units to calculate the magnitude, the difference was basically equivalent to the passage of a week. After a week, Marlin's face flushed red. He changed the direction of his heavy punch and bombarded the island below. The upper structure of Gongqi's isolation room collapsed in one fell swoop. The situation was the same as in the Abyss Area. There was no longer any resistance here, and there was no trace of the so-called Deep Blue Walker either. There was only the collapsed structure's wreckage mixed in with the mud powder and stones. Marlin stepped into the ruins. There were traces of the structure of space-time trembling here. There was also the smell of high-temperature baking mixed in with the smell of ionization in the air. The traces left behind were not few, but abundant enough to make one's brain explode. Vice President, the volcanic island's new plane, the mist illusion has disappeared. It seems like it happened before the lightning strike. Wolf, who was at the periphery, finally had the opportunity to come over and report. Marlin's face twitched. If anyone dared to say that the so-called new plane was a natural phenomenon that wasn't man-made, he would spit on that fellow's face right now. Chapter 789. Who in the world are you? A berserk thought swept out. Within the misty labyrinth, the sand painting that was temporarily pieced together by millions and millions of domain fragments soundlessly shattered. The previous scene stopped in the bloody light of raging flames. The human body warped and expanded until the moment it completely deformed and melted. The things that followed didn't have much meaning for Gongqi. He just knew that his fleshly body had reached the level depicted in the scene. It was already an irreversible destruction. Gongqi was still unwilling to believe the truth presented in the scene. He found it even harder to believe that his terrible situation was single-handedly created by an underage youth like Luo Nan. In a short amount of time, his thoughts cleaved apart the surrounding rolling and whistling dust storm countless times. He wanted to obtain a clear answer to support the absurd and terrifying logic of the scene. But there was no response from start to finish. He knew that such a state of mind was terrible. He tried to control it, but the changes in the situation from another space and time, as well as the deeper feedback from the Abyss region and the solidified configuration, made his calm and steady mind, which he had always been proud of, tremble and crack at the deepest level. He found it hard to restrain himself. Anyone who saw their own fleshly body liquefy and evaporate in the flames, turning into nourishing fertilizer for the other species, while their soul body in another space and time suddenly became a lonely ghost, would probably have this kind of feeling. At the same time, Gongqi also had to bear the impact of the solidified configuration in the Abyss region of Earth. This was equivalent to the rupture of his cultivation foundation. His soul body flickered indeterminately. His aura repeatedly fluctuated. This was much more accurate than the opponent's flashy sand painting. Gongqi wasn't an ordinary person by now. Snake Tongue had never seen Gongqi like this before. Of course, what happened on Chan City's holy land of cultivation, volcanic island, far exceeded her imagination. Right now, Gongqi still had the curtain of his extraordinary domain. He still possessed the strength of an extraordinary. However, Snake Tongue felt that the extraordinary soul body in front of her was unprecedentedly ethereal. It was like a vicious and ugly demon. It was unknown when it would melt under the sunlight. Snake Tongue's shock and fear towards Luo Nan, who had created all of this, was even greater than Gongqi's. She was also affected by the previous events. She was wrapped in absurd delight. These complex emotions pieced together Luo Nan's image in her mind once more. But even she knew that there were far too many subjective things stuffed into it. Layers upon layers of distortion and rendering. He was like an evil demon god, invading her already limited thinking bandwidth. Maybe this is another nightmare? Of course, it was leaked by Gong Qi. Perhaps Gong Qi sensed Snake Tongue's attention, but he suddenly turned his head. His actions were completely human and they were displayed by his spirit body. It was even more ironic at this time. Gong Qi himself sensed it as well, and his gaze changed to become unprecedentedly savage and terrifying. He no longer needed to conceal anything. He directly extended his hand and grabbed Snake Tongue, who was wrapped in the veil of silence. She didn't have the slightest ability to resist. However, Snake Tongue suddenly had a marvelous feeling when she faced Gong Qi like this. Her thoughts circulated, but they didn't take form. Instead, they were nimble like she hadn't been in a long time. Even though she was mocking herself, she said, "I almost forgot. I'm about to die." Dying from anger is perhaps the most worthless way to die. Gong Qi's spirit body abruptly underwent another wave of bright and dark changes, reflecting his seriously unstable emotions. Amidst the radiating psychic waves, Snake Tongue thought that her time was up. But in reality, the powerful pressure transmitted by the veil of silence retreated. "You're right, we can't waste it." Gong Qi's thoughts were heavy as he suppressed his emotions, and he was like a volcano that was in an unstable state. But his control had returned and it was still slowly increasing. He operated the curtain of extraordinary domain and did a few rounds of searching, but he still didn't find any trace of Luo Nan. He didn't get a reply either. After another round of failed attempts, he suddenly asked, "What do you think Luo Nan is doing?" "He's probably watching you make a fool of yourself." Snake Tongue completely let loose. She mocked him without the slightest bit of mercy. Gong Qi actually didn't get angry. He even discussed with a deadpan expression, "No, he's more likely dealing with some trouble. He and his accomplices destroyed my fleshly body, but that place is a volcanic island reef. It's a closed-door area. There are 3 to 5 extraordinaries there all year round. No matter how outstanding their previous infiltration was, it was impossible for them to escape unscathed after triggering the security system. It's precisely because a large amount of energy was involved there that he missed an opportunity to deal a fatal blow." Gong Qi's thoughts couldn't be said to be wrong, but what logic was behind the neat and tidy logic of his thoughts? For a time, Snake Tongue couldn't find the right words to describe this feeling. She just felt awkward and weird. He missed an opportunity. That's my opportunity. Gong Qi was still analyzing. His thoughts leaped back and forth. I've already leaped into the extraordinary realm. My soul body is indestructible. So what if my foundation is damaged? There are many ways to make up for it in this world. He still can't do anything to me. He doesn't possess the ability to kill me and he's missed opportunities again and again. When I first fell into the domain fragment trap when my fleshly body was destroyed. That's right. If I miss an opportunity, I'll be punished. My opportunity has come. Snake Tongue asked, "What opportunity?" Gong Qi let out a low chuckle. He didn't answer. The extraordinary domain curtain that rose up around his body clearly contracted and rolled back. Then, he escaped. Snake Tongue was truly stunned. She was under Gong Qi's control. She was unable to probe the changes in the external environment. She only knew that Gong Qi's speed was very fast. It didn't matter if his laws were chaotic within the sandstorm of the domain fragment. He just needed to use his own laws to temporarily replace and integrate them. The superiority of extraordinaries was displayed to the point of brilliance. The problem was that no matter how brilliant Gong Qi's flying techniques were, he was unable to change the nature of his actions. He ran away. He took advantage of Luo Nan's lack of attention to escape. He even ran away immensely proud of himself. Fine, he looked a bit excited. This kind of emotional bottom line was continuously exposed from his constant mental communication. Luo Nan destroyed my fleshly body. He ruined my foundation. He even transmitted the events that occurred in Earth's spacetime to me in real time. I know what he wants to do. He wants to crush my will, to destroy my spirit, to make me collapse without a fight. But his thinking is too simple. His live streaming was a major failure. He made this damned place establish a new connection with Earth's spacetime. The first reason was that you were tricked by him into becoming one with your body. The second reason was the backlash caused by the collapse of my foundation in the Abyss region. Adding in the live streaming, there are so many formulas. Why would I be afraid of not being able to solve the equations? Hearing Gong Qi's confident tone, Snake Tongue was skeptical. You solved it? I want to collect even more formulas. Gong Qi answered as if it was a matter of course. Luo Nan's biggest mistake was to treat this place as a trap. But this place isn't a warped cloud. Instead, it's a foundation and hub. Most importantly, it isn't monotonous at all. It's changing. As long as it's changing, there are rules that can be dug out. No matter how Snake Tongue viewed him, Gong Qi believed that he had already recovered from the blow of having his body destroyed. Moreover, he had entered an extraordinary state under the pressure and stimulation. His powers of observation were sharper. His train of thought was clearer. He discovered many hidden details and veins within the dust, mist, and sandstorm. Countless domain fragments were piled together within this misty labyrinth. At first glance, everything looked the same from every direction, but the details were different. There were large and small fragments. There were clear differences in the types and characteristics of their structures, as well as in the way they were distributed. They were completely different from the circulation of cloud energy in the clouds. People got lost here. On one hand, the laws were chaotic in this dangerous place. On the other hand, far too many disparate elements appeared in one's mind. It was the polar opposite of the cloud world. What's interesting is that the two are closely related. It's not just that one is on the outside and one is on the inside, one is on the inside and one is on the outside. It's because they both have suns. Suns? That's right. The suns that appear in the polar domain really do have an influence that reaches far and wide. We can see them in the clouds, but we can't see them here. However, there's a temperature that belongs to them. Gong Qi's spirit body revealed a lively smile. Do you remember? I once said that behind these domain fragments, there was bound to be an even more fundamental spacetime frame. Perhaps this is it. In the depths of the layered domain fragments, perhaps that sun is the core of the spacetime frame. It affects the operation of the dust, mist, and sandstorm. The fourth formula. When solving an equation under a limited number of unknowns, the more relevant and meaningful formulas there were, the easier it would be to find the answer. Gong Qi had this feeling, and it was becoming more and more intense. He began to make a hypothesis. If I take the sun hidden in the depths of the domain fragments and treat it as a fixed number, I can simplify the problem and do some calculations. Gong Qi took the initiative to stop his explanation and put a large amount of energy into his calculation work. His flying speed became slower and slower until he gradually came to a stop. This old thing seemed to really have a harvest. Just as Snake Tongue was pondering, an unforeseen event occurred. The whistling tremors of the dust storm in the outside world suddenly intensified. It was also in this instant that the previously turbulent environment, which could barely be considered safe, was stripped clean. The veil of silence was pulled away. If time was rewound 2 hours ago, perhaps Snake Tongue would be looking forward to this result even in her dreams. But now, after a series of unforeseen events, Snake Tongue's extremely weak spirit body core had already lost the ability to exist independently. As soon as it was exposed to the impact of the dust storm, it showed signs of disintegration. A tenth of a second later, Gong Qi used his aura to wrap around her, temporarily saving her life. However, this action was brimming with ominous intentions. She only heard Gong Qi say, "I've already unraveled your formula. Your value. Yes, I can still make use of it one last time." Snake Tongue didn't have time to react. She didn't have the opportunity to curse or express her hatred. Gong Qi flicked his finger, and the spirit body core wrapped in his aura was forcefully thrown into the dust storm. It quickly went far away. Chapter 790. Her final value was embodied here? Snake Tongue felt that it was absurd, but she also felt calm, as if she had finally reached her destination. Things had developed to this point, far exceeding the upper limit of her usefulness. Her repeated struggles had only resulted in this. Just like that, she was wrapped in a sandstorm of dust. It was as if she was in the turbulent flow of fate. She drifted with the waves until she reached the top. But in reality, her fate had been controlled by someone else from beginning to end. The temporary protective cover set up by Gong Qi determined the length of the final part of her life. The protective cover was firm. Even under the assault of the chaotic domain fragments of the laws, it was only slowly worn away. It was to buy as much time as possible for Gongqi to escape. At the same time it was sensitive. It was closely linked to Snake Tongue's soul structure. When the protective cover shattered, Snake Tongue would inevitably be destroyed along with it. Gongqi was certain that there was an unknown connection between Snake Tongue and Luo Nan. Therefore he used Snake Tongue to mislead Luo Nan's tracking direction. Of course, Luo Nan might not fall for it, but as long as he hesitated for a moment, a bit more time would be good. Snake Tongue saw through Gongqi's scheme, but it didn't matter. She just waited quietly like this. The legendary memories and repentance before her death never appeared. She had long since weakened to the point where she couldn't even bear her memories. Her thoughts and emotions flowed without limit. Even Snake Tongue herself didn't know what her thoughts and state of mind would be in the next moment. She believed that her candle-like life was about to disappear without a trace in this state. But at this time, Luo Nan's face inexplicably appeared in the lake of her heart. The relief sculpture of a human face pieced together by domain fragments, under the influence of her chaotic thoughts and emotions, transformed into a demonic god burning amidst the boundless space and time. The demonic god possessed a malevolent and sinister body, a lustrous and dazzling color. But in the end, all the elements settled in the pair of deep eyes that had never changed from beginning to end. They slowly became clear. Snake Tongue didn't know why she would allow this face to completely occupy her mind in the final moments of her life. Perhaps she had even unwittingly given away this little bit of autonomy. Snake Tongue gave up on everything. She allowed time to wrap around her as she indifferently advanced. She followed the most fundamental laws of the universe, gradually changing from order to disorder. The protective barrier began to disintegrate. The structure of the spirit body was also implicated, collapsing from the very foundation. Perhaps if time flowed a bit more, then the medium known as Snake Tongue would completely disintegrate from the material world and perish. But under these circumstances, Luo Nan, the demonic god that coiled and converged at the bottom of her heart, still existed. He existed steadily, not shifting from any change. Is it not a creation of my mind? Wouldn't it rot? It exists independently of me? Or could it be that at this moment when I'm about to collapse and perish, there's still a corner of my consciousness that's supporting me? Luo Nan, know that demonic god has been paying attention to me from beginning to end. Has he used a portion of his power on my side? If that was the case, do I still have a chance? There was still a chance of survival. Snake Tongue's already stagnant train of thought seemed to have come alive. It was like a candle that had already burned out, a spark in the ashes of a fire, struggling to not be extinguished. It was because of the endless desire for life that was hidden deep in the embers and had never been completely eliminated. At this moment Snake Tongue suddenly understood. In the end she was unwilling. He still wanted to live. She wanted to live. She wasn't willing to give up even the slightest possibility, the slightest trace of hope. She was already unable to rely on her own strength to continue living. Then she would plead and beg. Even if it was lowly and ugly, it was fine as long as she lived. Therefore her will that was on the verge of collapse burned in this way. Save me. My lord, I beg you to save me. I'm willing to give up everything. Everything. I'm willing to endure everything. Everything. I just ask to be entrusted in your shadow. I want to have a place to kneel and worship under your feet. I only have this humble request. I worship you as the ruler of life. I will listen to your judgment. Save me. Save me. The protective barrier silently collapsed, and the chaotic power of the sandstorm seeped in. The structure of her spirit body was like a sandcastle under the tide. It changed beyond recognition in an instant. Snake Tongue didn't have the strength to resist. Her consciousness suddenly dimmed. But in this instant of annihilation, the last clear thought that remained was, "Save me." This thought flickered, trembled, rose and fell. It could be extinguished at any moment. But in the end it still survived. Moreover, it really did connect with fuel. It recovered its brightness little by little. Snake Tongue woke up. Her soul fire supported her consciousness. Little by little she recovered the fragments of her memories and pieced them together to form a vein of thought. Then she discovered that she was currently attached to a thin thread that was hard to distinguish between real and fake. She was hanging alone in the nothingness. Soon bright and scorching rays of light spilled down, drawing her in to look up. Above her was a dense interweaving, three-dimensional and complex network. It was like a spider web, but it was hundreds of times more complicated. And at the core of the spider web was a blazing sun. It was so dazzling that it was hard to look directly at it. Even the red light that was spitting out from the edges covered the entire spider web structure. At this moment, the thin thread that was attached to Snake Tongue was hanging down from the spider web structure. It was directly connected to the spider web and pulled her closer and closer to the spider web. During this process, the sound of crashing could be heard without end. Some were extremely far away, coming from the upper core of the spider web structure. Some were extremely close, belonging to the thin thread that pulled her in. This thin thread was an exquisite and tough chain. It directly penetrated her mind, firmly locking her down without leaving any leeway. As a curse master of orthodox origins in the shrine, Snake Tongue quickly understood. Her mind was submerged in an extremely symbolic space of consciousness. She clearly understood where she belonged, and she experienced the fundamental restraints and corresponding status she received from the demon god Luo Nan's system. In other words, she was still here. She was still alive. Snake Tongue laughed loudly. She didn't care about the chains binding her mind. She didn't care about the spider web and the sun that grew closer and closer. She didn't care about the unpredictable fate that awaited her. She just indulged herself, laughing happily in this space of consciousness. Her surging emotions were burning. But right now she had the qualifications. She had the capital. She could wantonly waste and vent her emotions unless the demon god that controlled her life ordered her to stop. Luo Nan didn't stop her, and Snake Tongue was finally done laughing. She got closer and closer to the sun web. The closer she got, the more complex and precise the structure of the spider web she could see. The number of connected nodes increased. She had felt lonely before because she was in the outermost region. She was far from the center. In fact, there was another chain hanging down from the spider web in this outermost region aside from the thread she was at. It just so happened to intersect with her thread and cast into the depths of the void. It was unknown where or who it was connected to. Chapter 791. Gong Qi moved at high speed amidst the dust and sandstorm. He didn't stop to rest for over 10 hours. He needed to use his extraordinary domain to integrate the chaotic and collapsing fragments of his domain. He needed to open up a path in the void where there was no path. He also needed to endure the destruction of his fleshly body and the damage to his foundation, which brought chaos and disturbance to his extraordinary domain. This undoubtedly increased his consumption, whether it was in terms of energy or mental strength. But Gong Qi gradually calmed down as time passed. Luo Nan had yet to catch up to him. Gong Qi had most likely thrown him off. Perhaps it was temporary, but he used this time to stabilize the negative effects of his fleshly body to the greatest degree. His combat strength had rebounded compared to the fiercest initial assault. He should be able to reach 60 to 70% of his peak. 60 to 70% of extraordinaries were still extraordinaries. Gong Qi was confident that he could deal with the vast majority of unforeseen events. Moreover, the Guardian on Volcano Island is enough to give Luo Nan and the power behind him a hard time. That old fox Abner should be able to mend the pen after the sheep is lost as long as he puts in a bit of effort. Gong Qi thought about many things in the span of over 10 hours. The changes in the situation on Earth were only a very small part of it. He spent most of his time and energy exploring and verifying the misty labyrinth environment. Moreover, he had more and more ideas. My initial judgment was correct, and there are no problems with the direction of my calculations. This shattered space has a close interference relationship with Earth's space-time. The cloud world outside is very likely the product of this interference. Therefore, it possesses environmental conditions similar to Earth, but it is distorted and absurd. It seems boundless, but it is actually just a monotonous cycle of the structure of space-time. Gong Qi also understood that there were still many unsolved mysteries within the cloud world. For example, the blood-colored monster apes that shuttled back and forth were already complete living bodies. Where they came from and where they belonged was completely unknown. But he wasn't a space-time research expert. He wasn't a distortion scholar. He didn't rely on this to make a living. He just wanted to return to Earth's space-time to deal with the chaotic situation. He only had this goal and nothing more. Once he caught his breath, he would uproot Luo Nan and the power behind him. He would even uproot the Xia City branch. Moreover, he would use the most vicious methods on Luo Nan's body. He would use them on all of Luo Nan's friends and family. He would let that little bastard truly experience what despair and regret were. Gongqi showed signs of letting go of his thoughts and emotions. He suppressed them with great difficulty and comforted himself. Soon. The 4 clues and 4 formulas that he had found in succession were enough to express the interference relationship between the 2 spacetime on different levels. It was from these 4 formulas that he deduced that he discovered more clues and made a series of basic judgments. The structure of the interference between the 2 spaces was rather complicated. There could be 2 or 3 core interference zones and they could change at any time. In other words, the 2 spaces were in a state of activity relative to each other. Sometimes they were more closely connected and sometimes they were separated. The easiest way to return to Earth was, of course, to find the core interference zone and destroy the relatively fragile barrier there. But it was not absolute. As long as he could control the basic structure of the interference, it was fine to be a little more on the periphery. It wasn't easy to identify 2 or 3 core interference zones. The 2 spacetime interference points were definitely not in a one-to-one correspondence. The slightest difference could make a huge difference. Comparatively speaking, the misty labyrinth was easier to deal with. After all, it was more intuitive and he could observe how the domain fragments worked together. He would be able to find some clues. On the other hand, the spacetime of Earth was separated by a layer. There was no way to sense it. It was impossible to rely purely on calculations. Gongqi's train of thought was quite open. He used some information outside of technology to make up for it. His train of thought was like this. Did Luo Nan, a teenager, really have the ability to blaze a different path? The possibility of him inheriting the legacy of his elders was greater. He had studied Luo Nan's information before. Although it was relatively superficial, he still knew about Luo Nan's grandfather and father's research back in the wilderness. The information displayed the direction of their research and the main areas of activity. There was no need to talk about Xia City. There were also a few plateaus in the border region of the Eurasian Plate and the Indian Ocean Plate. The area around Spring City was the longest. Gongqi first placed Xia City's priority on the back burner. He still did not know what role Ouyang Qin and Wu Jiong played in this matter. Even though he was certain that Luo Nan was a protective puppy who did not report the matter of the Cloud World to the Xia City branch, he did not dare to gamble. After all, the resources that Luo Nan displayed far exceeded the upper limit that a young man should have. What if the Xia City branch really did participate? They would simply be surrounded and killed if they returned from there. Comparatively speaking, Spring City was the best entry point. If this interference zone truly existed. No, it certainly existed. Gongqi had already circled back and forth in a designated suspicious area for 4 or 5 hours. The more he circled, the more excited he became. He felt that he was already very close. This was not an illusory feeling. This was real evidence. He raised his hand and the bead of light wrapped in his aura floated up. It was similar to how he took care of Snake Tongue, but this time he was even more careful. There was a fragment within the bead of light. It was not something as high and mighty as a domain fragment. Instead, it had something similar to an insect's appendage. Fine, it was not similar. It was an insect's appendage. This was his greatest harvest after coming to this area. 5 hours ago when Gongqi discovered this toy, it was much more complete than it was now. At the very least he could see what its true form looked like. Gongqi was confident that he would be the first to capture this little toy as soon as it floated past his sensing range. He would absolutely not miss it. The radiance of his spiritual body suddenly rippled. It seemed to resonate with the fine spatial ripples at the edge of his sensing range. Gongqi quickly suppressed the throbbing in his heart. He stared closely at that area and silently covered it up. The operation of the dust storm in that area was slightly affected. A portion of the domain fragment lost speed and collided with the other fragments in the surroundings. Some bounced off each other, while others were stimulated to emit annihilating electric flames. Little by little they accumulated and blossomed into an expanse of bright light in the void. The light quickly disappeared, but it annihilated the foreign species that had rushed in earlier into that area into ashes. But a mere second later, new foreign species crawled out from the fine spatial ripples. In the blink of an eye, they were engulfed by the sandstorm and involuntarily flung away. What awaited them was undoubtedly a destructive fate. But in this instant, Gongqi had already approached quickly enough to determine the appearance, species and origins of these little foreign species. Ants. Ant-like life forms. They were red and lustrous like blood and fire. Just based on their ability to struggle in this shattered space and the dust storm, it proved that they were no ordinary insects. There was a high probability that they belonged to a mutant species. Mutant species ants' blood. The most famous of them all was naturally the fire god ant. That's right, it was the Spring City area's specialty, the fire god ant.